She agreed to fake date the Korean Mafia boss. Then he introduced her as his future wife. You said yes to one dinner, one night, one simple performance in front of people who would never see you again. That was the deal. That was all that was supposed to be. You needed the money. He needed someone believable enough to keep his rivals from probing his personal life. Clean transaction. No feelings, no complications. You shook his hand in a parking garage at 11 p.m. and told yourself you were smarter than this situation, that you could walk in, play a role, walk out. That a man like Kang Joon-ho, with his tailored suits and his cold eyes and the way entire rooms shifted when he entered, was just a job. You almost believed it. Then came the night of the So family dinner. 40 people. 3 generations of Korean organized crime sitting around a table that cost more than your apartment. And Joon-ho stood up, glass in hand, with that expression you had already learned meant he had decided something without consulting you, and introduced you not as his girlfriend, not as his companion, as his future wife. If you stay until the end of this video, you will understand how a fake arrangement became the most real and dangerous situation of your life, and what happens when a man who controls everything decides he wants something he was never supposed to keep. Before that dinner, before that introduction, before everything changed, you need to understand who you were walking into that world as. Not naive, not reckless, careful, actually, methodical. The kind of person who reads contracts twice and still asks questions. You had built a small, stable life in Seoul, far from home, far from the version of yourself that made impulsive decisions. You were good at your job. You were good at being invisible in the right moments. And you were very, very good at reading people, which is exactly why his assistant approached you, because Joon-ho didn't need someone beautiful. Seoul had plenty of beautiful. He needed someone convincing, someone who could sit across from people trained to detect deception and not flinch, someone who understood social performance well enough to execute it under pressure. You fit every requirement on a list you never knew existed. The first meeting was brief, clinical. He looked at you the way someone looks at a contract, assessing terms, calculating risk. He spoke in measured sentences, outlined expectations, named a figure that made your carefully controlled expression almost break. You counteroffered, because reading the room told you he expected it, and meeting expectations without friction would have made you seem too easy to manage. He accepted without blinking. You signed nothing. His word was the contract. And somehow, in a way that unsettled you more than you admitted, that felt more binding than any paper ever could. The first public appearance was a charity gala. 300 people. Cameras. The kind of event where every interaction is simultaneously social and strategic, where who stands next to whom communicates alliance, and who avoids whom communicates war. Joon-ho briefed you in the car with the efficiency of someone running a military operation. Names, faces, relationships. What to say, what never to say. Who to smile at warmly, and who to smile at carefully. You absorbed it all, and asked 3 questions he didn't expect. Sharp ones, about dynamics he had summarized too quickly. He looked at you differently after those questions. Not warmly, with recalibration, like someone updating an assessment mid-process. At the gala, you performed. You were warm where warm was needed, measured where measured was strategic. You deflected 2 probing questions from women who were clearly testing the authenticity of your relationship with a grace that came from genuine skill, not rehearsal. Joon-ho noticed. You noticed him noticing, and you filed that observation away with the same discipline you filed everything. Useful information, nothing more. The ride home was quiet. Almost at your stop, he said something that wasn't in the briefing. Something small, a detail about the evening that he had found, and here was the word that didn't fit the clinical framework you had built around him, amusing. You looked at him. He was already looking out the window. And something shifted, imperceptibly, dangerously. Weeks passed, appearances accumulated, and with each one, the performance became simultaneously more natural and more complicated. More natural because you learned each other's rhythms, the way he placed his hand at the small of your back when someone approached he didn't trust, the specific way you tilted your head when agreeing with something you actually disagreed with, the silences you had developed that read as intimacy to everyone watching, and were simply, you told yourself, professional shorthand. More complicated because the line between performance and reality requires constant active maintenance, and constant active maintenance is exhausting. You started noticing things you hadn't budgeted for. The way he remembered details you mentioned once in passing. The way he positioned himself physically between you and anyone who looked at you a half-second too long. The way he asked after particularly demanding evenings, not how the performance went, but how you were. Small word, enormous difference. You told yourself it was investment protection, that you were an asset he needed functional, that care in his world was always transactional. You were mostly convincing. Then came the evening he canceled an international meeting, something his assistant communicated to you with barely concealed shock, because you had mentioned offhand that you weren't feeling well. He showed up at your door with food from a restaurant you had referenced once in a conversation you didn't think he was fully present for. You let him in. That was the first real mistake. The So family dinner was supposed to be the last appearance. The arrangement had a timeline. You had agreed on it explicitly. This dinner, this final performance for the most important audience, and then a clean exit with a plausible story about mutual incompatibility. You had rehearsed your own goodbye. In the car on the way there, Junho was quieter than usual. Not the operational quiet of someone running briefings, a different quiet, the kind that fills space rather than empties it. You didn't ask. You were already managing your own internal landscape, which had become significantly more complicated than the original contract anticipated. The dinner was everything he had described and more. The So patriarch watched you with the specific attention of someone who had built an empire by finding the weakness in everything. His wife asked you questions that sounded social and were archaeological, digging for inconsistency, for the seam between performance and person. You held every question, answered with the right mixture of warmth and boundary. You were objectively exceptional. Then Junho stood, glass raised, the room quieted with the automatic deference of people long trained to give him silence when he chose to speak. And he spoke. And the words that came out were not any version of anything you had discussed, prepared, or agreed upon. Future wife. Your name. His voice. 40 people witness. And your face, your perfectly trained, professionally controlled face, did something it had not done in months of performances. It went completely still.
You smiled, because the only alternative was something that would have cost both of you everything in that room. You smiled and you reached for his hand and you performed the most important 30 seconds of the entire arrangement. The convincing warmth of a woman who had just heard exactly what she expected to hear from the man she loved. 40 people exhaled into celebration. The Seo patriarch raised his glass. His wife touched your arm with something that felt, unexpectedly, like genuine warmth. And Junho looked at you, for just a moment before the room consumed him in congratulations, with an expression you had never seen on him before. Not calculation, not assessment. Something that had no place in the contract you had signed with a handshake in a parking garage. In the car afterward, you waited until the driver's partition was up. Then you looked at him. He spoke first, which surprised you, because Junho almost never moved first in a conversation that carried personal weight. He said he would explain. You said you were listening. What he explained was not an apology. It was, in the precise and considered language he used for everything that mattered to him, a proposition. Not the original one. A different one. One that had no timeline, no exit clause, no performance requirement. One that was, by every measure you could apply, completely real. You looked at him for a long time, and then you asked the question that changed everything. Why me, and why now, and why like this? Here's what that question revealed, and what this story is actually about beneath the surface of its drama. Power, in any world, creates a specific kind of isolation. The more absolute the control, the more complete the loneliness. Kang Junho had spent years surrounded by people who responded to him not to who he was, but to what he represented. Every interaction filtered through hierarchy, through fear, through strategic interest. In that environment, authenticity becomes the rarest possible currency. And you, with your counteroffer in a parking garage, your sharp questions in a car, your face going still instead of performing panic at an announcement that upended everything, had been, without intending it, completely authentic in every moment that mattered. You hadn't tried to impress him, you had tried to navigate him, which to someone fluent in performance and manipulation read as the most genuine thing in the room. Research on attachment in high-control environments consistently shows that genuine connection becomes disproportionately powerful precisely because of its scarcity. For Junho, you hadn't been a convincing girlfriend. You had been the first person in longer than he would admit who responded to him like a person rather than a position. The fake arrangement hadn't created something artificial. It had created enough safety, enough distance from stakes for something real to surface. That's what he was trying to say in the car, in his precise, considered, emotionally under-practiced way. Did you feel it too? That thing that grows in the space between pretending and meaning it? And here is the answer you promised yourself at the beginning. What actually happens when a man who controls everything decides he wants something he was never supposed to keep? He doesn't fold it into the existing structure. He rebuilds the structure around it. What Junho heard in that car was not romance in the conventional sense. It was, consistent with everything you had learned about how he operated, a complete reorganization of terms. He had identified something he valued. He was proposing to protect it properly, which meant, in practical reality, a conversation about what you actually wanted. Not what the arrangement required, not what the performance needed, what you wanted. That question, asked by a man whose entire world was built on deciding things unilaterally, was the most disarming thing that had happened in the entire months of your arrangement. You answered honestly, which meant you answered with the complication, that what you wanted had changed without your permission, somewhere between the first gala and the canceled international meeting and the food from the restaurant you had mentioned once. That the careful, methodical person who read the contract twice had somehow failed to account for the variable of him being, underneath everything, someone worth knowing. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said with the quiet certainty of someone making a decision he has already fully committed to, "Then we start from the beginning, the real one." What comes after that conversation is not simple. Nothing about two people from worlds this different, with histories this complicated, navigating a transition from performance to reality is simple. There are conversations that are harder than any public appearance. There are moments where the skills that made you valuable in the arrangement, the ability to read a room, to control your expression, to manage what you reveal, work against genuine intimacy, because intimacy requires exactly the opposite. There are people in his world who do not welcome the change, whose interest in his personal life was served by its previous absence. The Seo patriarch watches you differently now, not as an asset being evaluated, but as a permanent variable being integrated into a long game you are only beginning to understand. And there are things about who Junho is and what his world requires that no arrangement, however extended, fully prepared you for. Real is harder than performed. It asks more. It costs more. It also, and this is the part that surprises you most, gives back in ways that performance never could. The moments that are genuinely his, not calculated for an audience. The version of him that exists in the spaces between obligations. The specific way he looks at you when he thinks you're not looking, not assessing, not managing, just looking. You have started to understand something that applies far beyond this story. That the most terrifying thing about letting something be real is exactly what makes it worth it. You said yes to one dinner. You were wrong about what you were actually agreeing to, but not in the way you feared when he stood up at that table. You were wrong because you underestimated the capacity of proximity to change what something is. You thought you could perform closeness without it becoming anything. You thought the contract was the container. It wasn't. You were the container, and you were less sealed than you believed. What you have now is not what you planned. It is more complicated, more exposed, more demanding than the clean transaction you negotiated in a parking garage. It is also, and you are still getting used to saying this without your carefully trained expression doing something involuntary, more yours than anything you have built by being careful. The lesson that lives inside this story is not about love overcoming circumstance, though that is part of it. It is about what happens when we let something real find us inside an arrangement we built specifically to prevent that. Sometimes the structure we create to stay safe is exactly what makes us available to be found. If you made it to the end of this, you carried this story all the way through. That means something. The channel continues with stories like this, complex, human, unfiltered, and without